A white man sat in the courtroom, smirking. Outside, the southern summer sun beat down as if it wanted to burn the whole town to the ground. But in this cramped little room, the real heat didn't come from the weather, it came from the suffocating injustice hanging over the head of a black woman. She was no criminal. She hadn't stolen, hadn't killed, hadn't betrayed anyone. The only crime the system pinned on her was the color of her skin. And they wanted her silent. They wanted her to bow her head, to accept the humiliation that thousands of black people before her had been forced to accept. But this time was different. She stood up. Her voice rang out in the courtroom, not a plea, but the breaking of a curse that had lasted for centuries. I will not bow my head anymore. This was the American South in the 1940s, 1950s, where Jim Crow laws had taken root like poisonous thorns. Where just having a different skin color could seal your entire fate. A white man could kill a black man in the middle of the marketplace and walk away free. Meanwhile, a black woman, simply for refusing to give up her seat on a bus, could be dragged to the ground, shoved behind iron bars. How could it be? How could a legal system, built to protect justice, become the tool of tyranny? How could a courtroom, meant to shine with truth, be so dark that one woman had to stand alone against a machine built to crush her soul? If she had been white, it would have been different. No one would have silenced her. No one would have torn up her testimony. No one would have dared to sneer as she stepped to the stand. But her skin was turned into an invisible sentence, and judges, prosecutors, police, all spoke with the same voice: you are not human like us. God taught forgiveness. But what forgiveness is strong enough to heal when, day after day, people are stripped of their right to live as human beings? What forgiveness could ever soothe the cries of mothers who lost their children to a sham trial? If there's one thing I've learned from this story, it's this: sometimes, to change the world, you can't wait for someone else to bring you justice. You have to rise up yourself, even if the whole world stands against you. And by the end of this video, you'll see exactly how one black woman, with no money, no power, no backing, turned her weakness into a flame that shook an entire unjust legal system. The rickety wooden house stood at the end of a dusty red dirt road. The southern sky in 1932 was sweltering, not a breeze in sight. A young black girl sat on the front steps, staring at her worn-out sandals, the straps barely holding together. She was only 8 years old, yet in her eyes lingered a weariness no white child her age would ever know. Her mother worked as a washerwoman for a wealthy family in town. Her hands were cracked, raw, and burning from cheap soap. Her father labored endlessly at the lumber mill, but the meager pay could barely keep food on the table. And no matter how hard he worked, people still spat the same word at him: nigger. The little girl watched quietly. Every day, it was the same. At the market, she saw it clearly: white folks walked straight through the front door. Black folks had to go around back, crowded together, waiting like beggars. On the bus, the bright front seats were reserved for whites. Black riders, even pregnant women, were left to stand, swaying for hours. In her heart, a wound grew deeper with every passing day. Why should skin color decide a person's fate? One summer afternoon, while she followed her mother to work, she saw it happen with her own eyes. The white mistress slapped her mother across the face for spilling a few drops of water on the floor. Blood trickled from her mother's lip. She didn't fight back, only bent down, wiped the floor clean, and whispered an apology with her head bowed low. The girl hid in the corner, trembling, one question burning in her chest. If she were white, would they have humiliated her like that? That question became a flame, haunting her through childhood. At 15, she was stopped by police on her way home. The reason? You look suspicious. They searched her pockets, threw her belongings onto the dirt, and laughed. One officer eyed her from head to toe, his gaze circling like a predator. For the first time in her life, she felt a paralyzing fear, not because she had done wrong, but because she knew that if they wanted to, they could turn any black person into a criminal with nothing more than a sheet of paper and a charge scribbled on it. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "Daughter, the law in this land isn't here to protect us. It's a chain to keep us on our knees." But somewhere deep inside, another voice rose, her own voice. No. It can't stay this way forever. One day, someone has to stand up. And from that moment, the seed of resistance was planted. Years later, the girl had grown into a woman, standing in a crowded courtroom. Her face was weary, but her eyes burned with fire. The room was filled wall to wall with white men, judges, jurors, prosecutors. They stared at her as if she were beneath them, a defiant slave. But she was no longer the frightened little girl in the corner. Before them all, she spoke the words her entire community longed to hear. You can throw me in prison. You can break my body. But you cannot break the truth. In that moment, a courtroom became a battlefield. Not between two individuals, but between one black woman standing alone and an entire system of injustice. Alabama, 1944. A sweltering afternoon. The bus rumbled down the dusty red road. A young black woman, barely in her 20s, had just finished her shift at the sewing factory. Sweat streamed down her face, her hands raw and bleeding from the needlework. All she wanted was to sit, just for a few minutes, to stop her body from trembling. She climbed aboard, dropped her coin in the box. The seats at the front were empty, but everyone knew those were forbidden. White passengers sat in the front, black passengers were crowded in the back. No matter how many empty seats there were, Jim Crow laws forced black people to stand, to bow, to endure. That day, her legs gave out. She lowered herself into an empty seat in the middle row. Seconds later, a white man stepped on. He glanced down, narrowed his eyes. The driver turned and barked. Get up. That seat's not for you. The bus fell silent. The other black passengers dropped their heads, hearts pounding, as if they had seen this scene too many times before. But not her. She stayed where she was. The driver's voice hardened. You want me to call the cops? In her mind, her father's words echoed, the law doesn't protect us. But at the same time, another fire rose within her, if I stand today, tomorrow my daughter will have to stand too. And the day after. Generation after generation, no one will ever have the right to sit. She lifted her head, stared straight ahead. I will not stand. The air on the bus froze. The driver roared, slammed the brakes, and rushed outside to summon the police. Two officers stormed in, their eyes cold as steel. One grabbed her by the arm, yanking her out of the seat. Her frail body hit the filthy floor with a thud. Stupid nigger, one hissed. Who do you think you are to defy white man's law? She clenched her jaw, silent. Blood seeped from her lip. What people saw in her eyes was not fear, but defiance. She didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't cry, she stayed silent. And it was that silence that shook everyone on the bus. News spread quickly, a black woman dared to defy the order on a bus. They called it the crime of disobedience. But in truth, it was only one woman asking to sit like any other human being. On the day of her trial, the courtroom was packed. A white judge. A white prosecutor. An all-white jury. The whole town came, not to seek justice, but to watch a woman be broken. The prosecutor thundered. She broke the law. She defied order. If we let her go, tomorrow every Negro will rise up. Applause erupted from the white section. But then, in the middle of the noise, the woman stood. Her voice was steady. All I wanted was to sit. I didn't hit anyone, I didn't steal, I didn't harm a soul. I only wanted to be treated like a human being. And if that makes me a criminal, then it is this system that is guilty. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. White men sneered, mocking her words. But here and there, a few faces dropped, if only for a moment, for they knew she had spoken the truth. That day, the verdict was delivered, guilty. Fined. Imprisoned. A black woman had stood against them, and the entire system moved to crush her. But what they didn't know was this: in that very moment, a fire had been lit in the hearts of thousands of black men and women. A fire that would never be extinguished. The iron door slammed shut behind her, the clang echoing like the stroke of an axe. Damp darkness pressed in. A southern prison in the 1940s had no need for decoration. It existed only to remind black people that they were nothing more than bodies, ready to be tossed around at will. The woman sank onto the freezing cement floor. Her arms throbbed from where the police had twisted them. Dried blood clung to her lips. But what cut deepest wasn't the pain on her skin, it was the mocking laughter of the white men outside, certain they had won. From the shadows, a whisper rose. "Are you crazy? Why didn't you just get up and save yourself the trouble?" It was the voice of an older woman in the corner of the cell, her clouded eyes fixed on her with pity, as if looking at a fool. "We've lived our whole lives with bowed heads. You think you alone can change that?" She stayed silent. Yet in her heart, an unspoken answer burned. If everyone bows their head, then who will be the first to lift it? That long night, curled beneath a thin blanket, her mind swirled with restless thoughts. Sermons from church echoed in her memory. The Lord says forgive. The Lord says show mercy. But forgive whom? Forgive the policeman who laughed while twisting her arm? Forgive the judge who turned truth into a farce? Forgive the law that treated black people like livestock? Rage blazed inside her chest. Yet another thought slipped in. If I let hatred consume me, how am I any different from them? And there, in that darkness, she understood one thing. Justice is never handed down. It only comes when someone dares to demand it. In the days that followed, the guards wasted no chance to humiliate her. They spat slurs, called her a stupid nigger woman, forced her to scrub the floors on her knees, trying to break her as they had broken so many before. But every time her hands bled, she remembered the moment on the bus, the moment she refused to stand. From that memory rose a strange strength that kept her back straight. In prison, she met other black women. Some were locked up simply for raising their voice at a white man. Others for walking through the wrong door. Charges so absurd they cut like knives. Each story was proof. This system was never meant to protect, it was built to crush. One rainy night, as water dripped into puddles on the floor, she whispered to the women around her. "They want us to believe we're weak. But even here, in the dark, we can still choose to keep our dignity." A young inmate trembled as she asked, "Aren't you afraid?" She looked toward the crack of the iron door, where lightning tore across the sky, and answered softly, "Of course I'm afraid. But what scares me more is my daughter growing up in a world where no one dares to say no." Her words fell like a stone into still water, rippling through the hearts of the women around her. From that night on, they no longer looked at her as foolish. They looked at her as a spark in the darkness. When the day of her release came, a crowd of white townsfolk waited outside. Some spat at her. Others shouted curses. But in the midst of the chaos, a few black faces stood silently behind her. They didn't dare come close, but in their eyes, she saw admiration. An old preacher stepped forward and whispered, "Child, you've done what we've been too afraid to do for generations." She did not smile. She only replied quietly, "This is only the beginning." And so, from a single act of defiance on a bus, from a trial steeped in injustice, a black woman became a symbol. The system had thought it could break her. But instead, it had lit the flame that would rise against Jim Crow itself. The day she walked out of prison, the sky over town was heavy and gray, hot winds sweeping across the dusty streets. News of her case had spread throughout the region. In bars, white men spat and sneered, "Who does that nigger woman think she is, daring to defy the law?" In churches, kitchens, and fields, black folks whispered, "She did what we dreamed of doing, but never dared." Freedom was anything but easy. At the grocery store, the white owner shook his head and snapped, "I won't sell to you." At the old sewing factory, the manager frowned. "You stirred up trouble. We don't want the risk." Even walking down familiar streets, the stairs cut into her like knives. And yet, something unexpected began to happen. Each evening, as the church lights flickered, black women started coming to her. They didn't speak much, just sat close, listening. Then one of them, shy and hesitant, finally asked, Do you think we could stand up too? She looked at their calloused hands, their weary eyes. A fire rose inside her. If the flame had been lit in her, it was meant to be shared. So, in that cramped little room, she told her story. No embellishment, no hiding. She spoke of the humiliation of being dragged from the bus seat, the fear when the iron cell door slammed shut, and the strange strength that surged the moment she refused to bow her head. Justice is never given, she said, her voice low and sharp as a blade. Justice only comes when we demand it. Each night, more came. Farmers, factory workers, mothers with children in their arms. They crowded together, eyes shining in the dark. Her words rang out like a bell, waking a strength that had long been buried. But not everyone stayed silent. One night, as she returned home, the window was shattered, the walls scrawled with streaks of red paint, "Get out, you nigger traitor." A letter slid beneath her door, "Keep talking, and the Ku Klux Klan will take care of you and your family." That night, she sat at her table, hands trembling as she held the note. In her mind flickered the horrors every Southerner knew too well, the Klan dragging someone from their home, hanging them from an oak tree, lighting the fire, cheering in the dark. She could have stayed silent. She could have packed up and fled. But then she remembered the faces of the women in that cramped room, and the little girl's question echoing in her ears. "Mama, why can't I sit in the front seat?" If she gave up, the next generation would inherit the same chain of shame. The next morning, instead of disappearing, she stood at the steps of the church, her voice like thunder. "They can burn my house, but they cannot burn the truth. They can hang me, but they cannot hang justice. I will not be silent." Her words spread like wildfire. From then on, each threat from the Klan only drew more people to her side. Because they began to see, courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep walking in spite of it. At the gatherings, she didn't just speak, she taught. She showed them how to write petitions, how to file complaints even if the courts tossed them aside, how to stand tall before police without lowering their gaze. Small acts, but each one a weapon against an unjust system. Then, quietly, a young white lawyer joined them. He had been in the courtroom the day she stood alone, and since then, his faith in the system had crumbled. He whispered, "This system is sick. I want to help." She didn't trust him at once. But she came to see, to break down a wall, you sometimes need bricks from inside it. And so a fragile alliance formed, between the oppressed who refused to bow, and the few who dared betray the silence of privilege. The town began to tremble. For this was no longer one lone woman. This was a whole community learning how to lift their heads. A suffocating summer night. Out on the cotton fields near town, flames flickered in the dark. The Ku Klux Klan appeared in white robes and hoods, torches blazing high. Hooves pounded, savage cries tore through the night air. Black families huddled inside their rickety wooden homes. Children screamed. Men gripped hoes and shovels, but in their eyes burned the knowledge that no tool could stand against guns. She stood in the darkness. Her front door shook under violent pounding. A shrill voice pierced the night. "You won't keep quiet? Then tonight will make you." Her family trembled. She pulled her daughter close, her palms slick with sweat. Fear crashed over her like a raging tide. If they broke through, if they dragged her to the oak tree in the yard, who would protect her child? But then, from the depths of her chest, strength surged. She pushed her daughter into a corner and faced the door, her voice quivering yet unyielding. "You can kill me. But remember this, every time you hang one of us, 10 more will rise." The shouting outside faltered for a heartbeat. Then came a burst of manic laughter. Yet strangely, that night, the door never broke. The Klan left, leaving behind half-burned torches and an unfulfilled threat. Word spread quickly through town. She faced the Klan head-on. People began to whisper her name like a symbol. But fame carried danger. Every step she took was met with poisonous stares. Police stopped her on the street, searched her, beat her. One morning, a young black man from her group was arrested for nothing more than handing out leaflets calling for equality. When his family begged for mercy, the judge coldly declared, "In this land, the law does not belong to Negroes." She rose in court, not only for herself, but for her people. Facing furious prosecutors, she hurled words at them sharp as blades. "You speak in the name of the law. But what kind of law gives justice only to one skin color? You speak of order. But what order is built on our blood and tears?" In the courtroom, white spectators shouted for harsher punishment. But in the back rows, dozens of black faces hung on her every word. In her, they saw themselves, humiliated, crushed, but unbroken. That day, the unjust verdict still came. The young man was convicted. But then, something no one expected. As guards led him away, the black section of the gallery rose to their feet. They did not scream. They did not fight. They simply stood, silent, yet unbearably heavy. A judge whispered, his face pale, "We are creating a storm." And he was right. A storm had begun. She walked home and looked around her town. Beneath the blinding sun, black women carried water with their heads held a little higher. Black children walked not quite so hurried. And on a street corner, she caught the eyes of a white man, no longer filled with contempt, but with unease, as if, for the first time, he wondered, maybe we are the ones who are wrong. She knew the road ahead was long, bloody, and dark. But from a bus seat, from a damp prison cell, from a house that faced down the Klan, she had become a banner no one could extinguish. In the months after the unjust trial, the town was no longer the same. Every step she took down the street seemed to echo in two rhythms, one of hatred, one of admiration. White townsfolk spat insults, muttered death threats. Black voices, quieter, whispered her name like a prayer. Then one day, a young journalist from the north arrived. He had traveled more than 1,000 miles just to see with his own eyes the black woman who defied Jim Crow. In the dim light of her small room, he asked, "Aren't you afraid? The KKK has lynched hundreds, the courts have buried countless people under false verdicts. Why do you still stand?" She looked at him, her dark eyes burning with fire. "Of course I'm afraid. But if a life is spent only bowing your head, then you've been dead all along." That answer appeared in a small New York paper. Then it spread to Chicago, and soon to California. The article didn't romanticize. It told the truth, a black woman dragged from a bus seat, thrown into jail, threatened with death, yet still holding her head high against an entire system of law. Suddenly, the public roared. In the North, black churches held prayer services for her. White students began writing letters of support. Piles of envelopes stacked at her doorstep, with one message repeated, "You are not alone." But support came hand in hand with danger. Southern authorities fumed. Police trailed her every step. One evening, as she left the church, a police car blocked her path. An officer sneered. "You think you're a hero? What can one black woman change? Don't forget, down here the law belongs to us." She met his eyes and answered, word by word, "Your law is only strong when we stay silent. And I will not be silent." Those nearby heard it. A few black listeners nodded faintly. A few whites turned away, faces tense, as if for the first time they couldn't fully believe in the order they'd always been told was unshakable. Then, weeks later, something unexpected happened. A group of civil rights lawyers from the North came to see her. They proposed, "We want to turn your story into a case, so the whole country can see Jim Crow for what it really is." She sat still, hands clasped tight. She knew, if she agreed, there would be no turning back. She and her family could be wiped out overnight. But then came the flood of memories, her mother slapped in the kitchen, her father spat on as a boy, her own child driven from the front seat of a bus. She raised her head. "I agree. But remember this isn't about me. This is for all of us." The day the lawsuit was filed, northern newspapers exploded. Her name was hailed as the face of the Southern storm. Photographs of a small framed black woman with unshaken eyes filled the front pages across the country. Meanwhile, in the South, KKK flyers spread a new curse: this nigger woman won't live long. But the more they threatened, the stronger she became as a banner. Community gatherings grew. No longer just a few dozen in an old church. Now hundreds crowded the yard, hands raised in vow. We will not kneel again. She stood before them, her voice clear and commanding. They can chain us in their laws, but they cannot chain our souls. They can write their verdicts, but we will write history. A thunderous roar erupted. For the first time, a community smothered for centuries felt as if it could finally breathe. And so, from a bus seat, from a damp prison cell, the story burst beyond a single town, spreading across America. That autumn, a courtroom in Washington, D.C. thundered with footsteps. Reporters crowded the aisles. Cameras flashed non-stop. On the wooden stand, a small black woman faced rows of men in black suits, the powerful minds of the nation. This was no longer a bus disturbance case in a small town. This was a lawsuit against Jim Crow itself, the entire system of injustice that had stood for centuries. The prosecutor rose, voice sharp and indignant. Your Honor, if we tear down the boundaries between white and colored, society will collapse. Chaos will spread. This law has stood since the days of our fathers. It cannot be destroyed because of one stubborn woman. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. But when it was her turn, the woman stepped forward, her frail hands gripping the edge of the wooden podium. The room fell silent. I am not a symbol, she said slowly. I am just a woman who wanted to sit in a seat like any other human being. But if something so ordinary makes this whole system tremble, then it is the system that is weak. The air thickened. A few white reporters lifted their heads, eyes suddenly awake. A judge frowned, fist tightening around his gavel. Outside, on the courthouse steps, hundreds of black citizens and even some young white allies gathered. They held signs high: justice has no color. A 12-year-old girl whispered to her mother, Mama, she looks like light. But the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. In the South, lynchings increased. Black homes were burned. Her name appeared on the Klan's death list. A letter arrived at her home: this time, you won't escape. That night, she sat alone, staring at the flicker of an oil lamp. Fear slid into her chest, sharp as a knife at her throat. But then she remembered the faces of those standing outside the courthouse, the hundreds of letters from the North, the vow she had whispered in prison: if I fall, who will rise? She prayed softly, almost to herself. Lord, if you cannot give me strength, then at least give me a reason to keep going. And that reason is them. The trial dragged on for months. The press reported every day. The South shouted, tradition is under attack. The North countered, justice must rise above color. The nation split apart, like a river slammed open by floodwaters. One morning, as she walked into court, she froze in astonishment. Dozens of white students from the North linked arms with black youth from the South. Together they chanted, "We are one. We will not kneel." In that instant, she knew she was no longer alone. A small woman had become a banner, but now that banner carried thousands of footsteps, swelling into a movement that could not be stopped. And the government began to fear. A senator whispered to a colleague, "If we don't concede, there will be nationwide riots. If we do concede, the South's traditions will explode." Between those lines, the trial became an arena for a nation's fate. Would justice truly belong to all people, or forever be chained to skin color? The woman, slender in frame but blazing in spirit, stood still in the storm. And in the silence, all of America watched. On the day of the verdict, the sky was gray, storm clouds rolling as if ready to break. Inside the courtroom, the air was suffocating. The black woman sat upright, hands clasped tightly together. The gallery was packed with reporters, lawyers, and officials. Outside, the crowd roared, their voices crashing against the walls like waves. The judge struck the gavel, his voice dry and stern. The Supreme Court rules that certain provisions of racial segregation laws are unconstitutional. However, many other regulations remain. The division between white and colored does not end, but must now be reviewed case by case. In that moment, the room erupted. Reporters rushed to their typewriters, shouts rang through the chamber. White citizens raged, betrayal of the South. Black citizens, for the first time, wept with trembling voices, justice has cracked open. She did not smile. Silent tears streamed down her face. This was not yet freedom. This was not yet equality. But it was the first fracture in a massive stone wall. A small crack, yet enough for light to seep through. Outside, hundreds waited. As she stepped out, a young black boy ran forward, clutching her in his arms, whispering through tears, "I'm not afraid to sit in the front anymore." The crowd erupted in applause, chanting her name. And in their eyes, she saw hope blaze for the first time. But that very night, darkness struck back. Stones shattered her windows. A Molotov cocktail exploded against her porch. The family scrambled to smother the flames, smoke choking the air. Her daughter screamed, clinging to her. "Mama, why do they hate you so much?" Her heart ached. There was no answer that could erase the fear in a child's eyes. She only whispered softly, "Because I did the one thing they fear most, I refused to stay silent." That night, with the house scarred in smoke, she sat alone, eyes hollow. Victory in court had not freed her from danger. It had painted a target on her back. An old friend whispered, "You could leave. Go north. Somewhere safer. No one would blame you." But she shook her head. "If I leave, they will believe terror can win. If I leave, thousands will return to their knees. I would rather die, but die standing." The cost grew heavier still. One night, the white lawyer who had dared to stand by her was ambushed on his way home. He survived, but his shirt was soaked in blood. When she heard the news, she staggered. For the first time, she realized sacrifice would not only fall on her, but on anyone brave enough to stand beside her. At the hospital, she held his trembling hand and whispered, "I'm sorry for pulling you into this." He managed a weak smile. "Don't be sorry. I'd rather live with justice than die in silence." His words pierced her heart. She understood then, the path she had chosen was perilous not just for herself, but for all who joined her. And yet, despite the pain, despite the losses, the movement did not stop. Headlines blared, the walls of Jim Crow began to crack. Northern churches held fundraisers, sending money south. Black families placed her photograph beside their Bibles, a living symbol of defiance. She never once called herself a hero. In the dark of night, holding her daughter close, she only felt like a trembling mother, fearful of tomorrow. But outside, thousands spoke her name, not because she was flawless, but because she had dared to do what they never could. After the historic verdict, America erupted. Headlines spread like wildfire, "Jim Crow cracks." People argued in bars, on buses, in markets. The South screamed betrayal of tradition. The North rejoiced, a step toward justice. And in the midst of these two tides, millions of Black Americans realized, the prison door was no longer locked as tightly as before. The marches began. At first, only a few dozen, walking quietly down dusty streets, holding trembling signs, "We are human too." Police scoffed, swinging batons in warning. But the next week, hundreds. The week after, thousands. Streets thundered with the cry, "No more Jim Crow. No more silence." The woman who had once sat alone on a bus seat now marched at the front. Her footsteps beat against the pavement like a drum, calling a nation awake. Above, American flags rippled. And through the rising chants rang a truth no one could ignore: America could not call itself free if half its citizens still lived in chains of color. Police struck back with fury. Water hoses, snarling dogs, batons. Bodies fell, blood streaked the sidewalks. Screams tore the sky. A boy collapsed right before her, his shirt soaking red. She fell to her knees, cradling his small frame, her voice breaking. "Lord, Is this the price of freedom? But then, out of despair, another cry rose stronger. They can beat us, but they cannot break us. The crowd did not scatter, it grew. Northerners poured into the South. Students, preachers, even some white reporters dared to stand shoulder to shoulder with black marchers. Television carried the images across the nation, black bodies bloodied, yet heads held high. Millions of Americans stared at their screens in shock. Is this truly the land of freedom? At one massive march, as police lined up in ranks, she stepped forward, raising both hands. A shout thundered from the officers. "Back off, or we'll shoot." The crowd held its breath. A second stretched into an eternity. She stared straight into the barrels of their guns and declared, "You can kill me. But how will you ever kill the truth?" The crowd's roar exploded like thunder, shattering the sky. The police wavered. In that instant, the balance of power shifted, not toward the batons, but toward the hearts of those who witnessed. The movement was no longer the story of one woman, or one town. It had become a national tide. Each march, each letter, each headline joined together into a wave no force could stop. But with light came darkness. The Klan escalated terror. Night after night, explosions, screams, the stench of smoke and ash. She knew that each morning she awoke was a gift. Yet instead of retreating, she mounted the pulpit of a crowded church, her voice unwavering. "We have lived too long in fear. Now let that fear live in the hearts of our oppressors. Because when a people refuse to bow, no power on earth can break them." Those words were written down, printed in newspapers, broadcast on radios. They reached into the darkest corners of the South, touching the hearts of silent black men and women. And in every home, every field, every ragged classroom, a quiet belief began to bloom: the day of justice is drawing near. One May morning, in front of a southern high school, hundreds gathered at the gates, screaming, cursing. Police stood in formation, hands on their guns. Through the frenzy, a small group of black students walked forward, trembling. For the first time in the town's history, the law had forced the school to open its doors to them alongside white students. The woman stood behind them, her eyes fixed on every hesitant step. Shouts rang out, "Go back to your own schools." Eggs flew, bursting in blood and yolk. A little girl stumbled, tears streaking down her cheeks. The woman rushed forward, lifted her gently, and whispered, "Hold your head high. Today you're not walking for yourself alone, but for every child to come." The girl gripped her hand tight, then kept walking. The school doors closed behind the first black students ever to enter. Outside, the mob howled, but they could not stop the turning of history's wheel. The news swept the nation. Newspapers called it the day the doors opened. Photographs of black children stepping into white classrooms shook public opinion. People began to believe change was possible, small, fragile, but real. But with every spark of light, the darkness grew more violent. That night, the KKK came. They did not break down her door. Instead, they planted a burning cross in her yard, flames leaping as high as the trees. The whole town saw it, a fiery declaration: "We will burn every traitor." Her daughter clung to her, sobbing, "Mama, I'm so scared. I don't want you to die." She held the child, her heart breaking. Her shoulders shook, but her voice was steady. "Listen to me. Someday I may not be here. But if I fall, you must remember, your mother fell standing tall. And you must keep walking." That night, as the fire died and ash drifted into the sky, she sat alone in the dark. For the first time, her tears came, not for herself, but for the burden laid upon her daughter. A child who should have been dreaming of dolls, not haunted by the thought of death. The next day, something unprecedented happened. Under federal pressure, the local court was forced to acquit a young black man falsely accused. For the first time in living memory, the law had sided with them, even if only once. News of the victory spread, and shouts of joy filled churches, schoolyards, and fields. But she knew, this small victory had been bought with blood, with threats, with last night's flames. Justice came drop by drop, while the pain poured like a river. At a packed prayer meeting, she stood before the congregation, her voice hoarse. "We have seen the first light. But make no mistake, that light did not come from the mercy of the system. It came in exchange for blood, for courage, for steps that never turned back. If we stop, that light will die. If we go on, it will become a dawn." The crowd broke into tears. They clapped, embraced, sang aloud in the church, as though glimpsing a real tomorrow. As she stepped down from the pulpit, her hand clenched tight, one hard truth rang in her chest. Freedom is never free. It is always costly. And the price may well be my life. Winter winds howled through the cracks in the door. In the smoke-stained house, the woman sat silently, her trembling hand brushing the hair of her sleeping daughter. Outside, the southern night was thick with shadows. Somewhere out there, white hoods and flickering torches lurked. She knew, any night, they could come crashing in. She had just returned from a movement meeting. News poured in from everywhere: marches in Montgomery, protests in Birmingham, violence in Little Rock. Her name was being spoken in speeches, printed in newspapers, whispered in prayers. To thousands, she was a banner. But when night fell, when it was only her and her child in the empty house, she asked herself, was that banner worth the price of her daughter's life? A friend came to visit, voice urgent. "Leave. Go north. There you can keep fighting, and you'll be safe. Staying here is just waiting to die." She stayed silent, eyes heavy as they fell on her daughter. Inside her, a tearing conflict raged. If she left, the movement in her hometown would lose its heart. If she stayed, her daughter would live each night in fear. That night, an explosion split the sky. A bomb tore through the house next door, tin roofing flying like shrapnel. The whole neighborhood erupted in chaos. Her daughter shot up, trembling, screaming, "Mama, they're going to kill us." She held the child close, heartbreaking. For a moment, she wanted to let go of everything, to flee, to take her daughter far from this blood-soaked land. But then, like a cold blade, memory cut through. Her mother slapped in a kitchen, her father mocked as less than human, herself dragged from a bus seat, the darkness of prison, the burning cross. If she left, it would all repeat, again and again, for the next generation. The next morning, she dressed in simple clothes and climbed the church pulpit before hundreds. Her voice was hoarse, but unwavering. "They demand my silence. They demand I run. But if I run, I hand victory to violence. If I stay silent, I bury the hope of my daughter, of your children. I will not retreat. I will stand. And if the price is death, then let me die standing tall." The church shook. Tears blended with thunderous applause, with voices crying out, "We will not kneel again." Yet as she stepped down, her eyes were weary. An old friend touched her shoulder, whispering, "This road will consume your whole life." She nodded faintly, lips trembling. "Yes. But if no one pays the price, there will never be a dawn." That night, she sat by the window, watching her daughter sleep, then gazed out at the black sky. Inside her, a raw truth echoed. "Freedom may be a gift I never lived to see. But I must plant it, so my daughter can harvest it." Years passed. Her hair had turned silver, her calloused hands bore the marks of time. The lines etched into her face were not only from age, but from sleepless nights, from fear always lurking, from the blood and tears already spilled. But one morning, as she stepped out of the church, she saw a sight that made her heart tighten. On the street once filled with the white hoods of the Klan, now hundreds of black children walked hand in hand, laughing, heading to school in clean uniforms. No more segregation. No more back doors. The doors once locked tight had finally opened. The lawyer from years ago, now gray-haired himself, approached with a gentle smile. "We haven't won completely. But you see, the wall is cracked. And through those cracks, the light is pouring in." She nodded, her eyes brimming. Because she knew, today's light was bought by the darkness of so many who had fallen. The nameless graves, the blood-soaking southern soil. Even the tears of her own daughter, clinging to her at night and asking, "Mama, why do they want to kill us?" One day, she was invited to speak at a great march in the capital. Tens of thousands filled the square. American flags whipped in the wind. A sea of black and white faces stood together. The small black woman stepped onto the wooden podium, looking down at the endless crowd. Her voice rose, hoarse, yet hard as steel. "I am no saint. I am no hero. I am only a woman who was once dragged from a bus seat, once thrown into prison, once trembling before a house set aflame. But I learned one truth: justice does not fall from the sky. It is built by trembling hands that refuse to let go, by fearful steps that refuse to turn back." Applause thundered like a storm. She paused, drew in a deep breath, and delivered her final words like a blade. "You may feel this society is unjust. You are right. It is cruel, it is cold, it wants you on your knees. But remember this: injustice is not a reason to bow your head. It is the reason we must stand tall, must fight, and must create a new, more just society." The square erupted. The roar of voices rose like a tidal wave, sweeping away every shadow. And in that moment, she knew, even if she were to fall tomorrow, her legacy was already born, an unquenchable flame. On her final night, she sat by the window, gazing out at the familiar yard. The wind still blew, the southern sky still thick with darkness, but in the wind, she could hear whispers, the footsteps of millions who had walked after her, the laughter of children no longer driven from schools, the cry of freedom echoing across the nation. She closed her eyes. In her memory, the old bus seat appeared. The blood on her lip. The prison door slamming shut. The burning cross. All of it returned. But this time, not as wounds, rather as proof that she had stood, had fought, had never bowed her head. One day, they would speak her name in books, in classrooms, in prayers. But to her, it had always been something simple, an ordinary person who dared to say no. Perhaps the world would always remain unjust. Perhaps there would still be darkness, still be hate. But because people had risen, there was now a crack of light. And from that crack, someday, a dawn would break. She smiled, whispering like dropping a mic. "They wanted us silent. But we sang. They wanted us on our knees. But we stood. And because of that, they lost."